The Blairite Coup by Scott Waller. It took a long time, but it finally happened. The bona fide left-wing leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, coming back into politics years after his retirement, became Prime Minister of Britain. Following a heated campaign, the people decided to give the system they mistrusted a chance by putting a genuine reformer at its helm. Corbyn was elected with an outright majority wedded to an unambiguously socialist agenda. However, that majority was divided along factional lines. Many Labour MPs of the Blairite mould had got used to living in a country in which the interests of the moneyed elites called the shots, and the dominant individualistic neoliberal mentality was counterbalanced not by collective institutions or grassroots political activity, but by the kind of carefully crafted political rhetoric, media strategies, and slick political staging that their great master, Tony Blair, excelled at. Factional cracks started to gape when Corbyn sought to make good on his election pledge to renationalise the rail network. It is not that Blairites were particularly attached to a transport system that was expensive to consumers, inefficient on lines with high demand, and progressively pulling out of routes not frequently used. A system that was probably at the cause of a number of accidents, a system in which if you missed one train to destination X, you had to watch hundreds of empty seats on the next two trains belonging to another company stop in front of you and then speed off to destination X without you, because you didn't have the right ticket. No, on paper, Blairites could be swayed by arguments of natural monopoly in the case of rail. But there was a principle at stake. You don't nationalise any industry until all the anomalies and inefficiencies and inconveniences and disadvantages of privatisation have been fully explored and proved many times over. Renationalisation was the red line beyond which no self-respecting New Labour ideologue would willingly tread. It was what distinguished the dusty, austere, quasi-Brezhnevian socialism from Blair's new, trendy, photogenic social-ism, with that all-important hyphen separating the social from the coherent articulation, that is, the ism, of how society should be fairer. Never did a mark of punctuation have such a big job to do. That hyphen marked out a chasm between the ancestral demons of the collective id and the modern, managerial and entrepreneurial saints of the Blairite ego. Before long, Labour rebels started plotting with the Conservative opposition, but what were they to do to get rid of this most unwelcome, unbecoming socialist at the head of a gentlemanly club that had for decades been happily dominated by self-serving, avaricious cynics who got on with the difficult things once they had gone through the abhorrent, albeit necessary, ordeal of elections? The people had given the radical loony lefties an infuriatingly clear mandate. Not even the daily vitriol of distortion and slander pouring from the press had managed to convince the many-headed monster into voting against its own collective interests this time. The old recipes for sound, austere but unjust governance seemed no longer to be working. It was obvious that Prime Minister Corbyn would be unassailable during his honeymoon period, so they would have to hold back for the first 6 months. In this way, they could lull him into a false sense of security, at which point they would be able to strike more effectively. But strike they would. The Blairites were not particularly original in their thinking. To come up with an anti-Corbyn strategy, they took a leaf out of Tony Blair's book, or to be precise, out of Blair's dodgy dossier. That dodgy dossier exponentially exaggerated the ability of a third-world country, Iraq, crippled by years of cruel sanctions imposed by the free world, to destroy the free world at the flick of a switch. The fact that Blair's dodgy dossier led him to be thought of as a criminal by swathes of the free and unfree world alike, and would haunt him for the rest of his days, was not important to the Blairite plotters. What was important was that it had worked at the time. The Blairites thought that if they could just wave around a bunch of doctored figures, a few shocking pictures and allegations of the kind that put Corbyn on the defensive, then the country might be frightened into losing all confidence in its new government. Thus it was that they concocted a series of stories and produced a pile of indictments blaming Corbyn and the Corbynistas of all sorts of salacious and sensational stuff, usually rehashing the accusations of being too soft-hearted, too ideological, abetting anti-Semitism, or harking back to Soviet socialism. Mutterings and much pompous reference to the Magna Carta emerged about levelling various technical charges of impeachment that went back to the barons ganging up on King John when the kingdom apparently got a foretaste of modern industrial democracy, while barons were able to corral the monarchy into bowing to their interests and do baronial things like turn the screw on the Jewish moneylenders they owed monies to. The Blairites' efforts paid off. They finally ended up ousting the elected leader and his cabinet in a parliamentary coup. However, this coup did not go down well with the general public at all. Large protests began. They were supported not only by the left and various unions, but also by sections of the judiciary, many respectable names, and hundreds of other groups. The coup cabinet, as it was quickly dubbed, responded self-righteously at first, and then heavy-handedly. After the government wearied of wasting their breath explaining their basic moral soundness to a public that was obviously too pig-headed to listen, tear gas and water cannon were lavished on protesters. The army was called in to protect important government buildings and the city. In one tense moment, shots were fired on the crowd. The Corbynistas got their first martyr. This raised public anger to a new pitch. But the coup cabinet claimed that the soldiers were provoked and fully justified in their action. The government was technically right to hold to its claim that it was legally mandated, but soon enough that argument lost its validity, for they effectively became a rump parliament. Most Corbynista MPs staged a temporary boycott of the institution. For security reasons, the new cabinet, called the Emergency Cabinet by its followers, would not allow MPs who had, as they insisted, chosen of their free will to leave the democratic institutions of the nation, to return to Parliament. The rump hastily voted new powers for their emergency cabinet, then went off to their constituencies and let the cabinet get on with running the country without them. The coup cabinet, as I will call it since that is the preferred term in most accounts, was struggling to find legitimacy in a country that seemed to be collapsing around them. They then hit on a new idea. Why not call in an old hero of the nation to save the day? After all, none of the cabinet members themselves were either particularly well known or particularly popular. Somebody recognized for his talent with the public, somebody oozing with charisma, and somebody with experience would be a perfect candidate for the job. When Tony Blair answered his mobile phone and received the offer to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom once again, he nearly choked on the exotic Thai vegetable that he was still chewing on as he listened to the despairing but calm voice of the acting leader of the coup cabinet. The peripatetic erstwhile Prime Minister of the UK had been following events in his home country closely, but he had kept a wise distance from public involvement. That afternoon he had delivered to a select audience of elite Thais a lecture on national reconciliation, consisting mainly of worn anecdotes and old jokes. It was well known at the time that the social and political divisions of Thailand were extremely complex, even for natives and veteran observers to grasp. But Blair was not deterred by such intellectual bagatelles when it came to offering his own counsel, particularly since the foundation that invited him to Thailand was adding a 5-figure sum to his wealthy company, which, on top of cashing in on the fame of having been Prime Minister, basically specialized in trafficking influence among dubious heads of states, billionaires, and politicians around the world. Naturally, he said yes to the idea of reliving his glory years at the helm. His exact words were something like, "If I can do anything to serve my country in these dark times, I," etc. so they immediately shipped him back off to Downing Street. He was ceremoniously declared acting First Minister of the Emergency Cabinet of the caretaker government of the United Kingdom. They wanted to announce of Her Majesty's caretaker government, but even the Queen, who was by now well on the merciful road to senility, realized that it would not be wise to sully her name with such a decidedly ill-conceived project. The country apparently did not have fond memories of their media-friendly leader of 1997 to 2007. Civil protests were mushrooming everywhere. General strikes were called and followed through en masse. The papers were dubious about the return of New Labour's prodigal son, but deplored more the lack of support for the government. News outlets were full of talk about how various records measuring public disorder dating back to the general strike of 1926 were being broken, but the very facts that they cited with disgust caused jubilation among the population. Predictably enough, some protests turned violent. There were riots and talk of action groups advocating and practicing armed resistance. Predictably enough, the government enacted emergency decrees, and Blair spoke passionately about the need to root out terrorists in our midst. The terrible cycle of repression and revolt was threatening to kick in. The international community did not look on this situation indifferently. Donald Trump's America was taking a concerted but hesitant stance. The president was in negotiations with the Mexicans, who were trying to get concessions for agreeing on paper to pay for the fortification of a security wall that ran between their two nations so as to fulfill at least one of President Trump's conspicuous promises. Paris was torn between friendship and rivalry vis-à-vis the perfidious Albion that turned her back on the EU to do anything. The Germans were busy counting the numbers of suicides in southern Europe that they could have prevented if they had backed the flow of liquidity into their austerity-torn economies, allowed German wages to rise, and just generally got their heads around the difference between macroeconomic management and a morality play about running a debt-free corner shop. Other countries, however, did not stand idly by. A coalition forming around China, India and Brazil was in a table-thumping mood, and Russia was gleefully egging it on. China was shedding its isolationist philosophy, the doctrine that no state has a right to interfere with the internal affairs of another country, just as the US was unburdening itself of its imperial overreach. The Chinese had never forgotten Hong Kong and the gunboat diplomacy of the Opium Wars, which had the goal of facilitating rather than eliminating drug trade and consumption. In the 19th century, the authorities of the Chinese Empire, who wanted to stamp out their opium epidemic, had to face the might of a British Empire's war for drugs, as opposed to the more recent and more puritanical American war against drugs. There was no doubt a soupçon vengeance in the leader of the Communist Party, Mr. Song's proclamations about the world's moral responsibility to save a sick Britain from herself. The Indian Prime Minister, Mr. Singh, was probably sincere when calling vehemently for the defence of Indian nationals in the UK and those of Indian descent. In this he was seconded by the Pakistani Prime Minister, who even offered to cooperate militarily with India. It would seem that the old empire's troubles were bringing unity to the subcontinent for the first time since Imperial British troops abandoned it. An emergency session of the United Nations Security Council was called. Naturally, the Blairite Coup government was not allowed to participate because it was deemed illegitimate. India and China passed a resolution allowing for limited military intervention, which they kindly offered to spearhead. Thus, what the press called the Sing-Song Coalition saw the light of day. They acted very swiftly indeed. The coup government hastily prepared to defend itself and the nation. Blair kept conspicuously absent from the media. There was even speculation that he had gone off into exile. These rumours were partially dispelled when national television showed him giving an address to his supporters in the streets of London the day before the Sing-Song Coalition set off. Blair looked a little ruffled, no longer the confident performer he had once been. Some people on the news networks even suspected that the footage might have been taken from the archives or tampered with. The coalition stormed into a country unprepared to fight for an illegitimate cabinet and an unpopular leader. Disparity of might and preparedness meant that victory was assured for the sing-song blitzkrieg. Blair, the coup government, and their prominent supporters went into hiding. The last pockets of resistance threw down their arms outside the capital. Shortly thereafter, London was liberated. Although victory was easy, reconstruction was an entirely different matter. Things got off to a bad start when it was announced that Corbyn and key Corbynistas had been severely wounded or killed in a building that was bombed during the invasion. The Sing-Song coalition claimed that it was a murderous act by Blairite terrorist forces, but this claim has not been verified to date. The victorious army decided to handpick their own provisional government, which was given the job of preparing a new constitution. The first draft of this constitution would criminalize Blairites and sympathizers. It is not certain how, perhaps it is simply a case of the squeaky wheel getting the oil, but Sing and Song chose a government mainly from the Celtic fringe, headed by people with strong links to the Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, and Sinn Féin. They were not touted as Celts, they were portrayed as competent technocrats. But all the same, the backbone of the English nation was deeply wounded by what they perceived as their exclusion from this new liberated political order. While the provisional government tried to keep its grip on power, society got more and more chaotic. Insurrectional Blairites and English nationalists started committing sabotage and carrying out acts of violence. The English nationalists formed voluntary brigades all over England. At the same time, groups of public school NCOs, happy to convert their soldierly games into real actions, rallied round Prince Harry, who not only fought for the expulsion of the Sing-Song coalition, but also called for a total moral reform of the UK. Prince Harry became a charismatic leader of the cause of resistance to foreign occupation. His troops started killing Scots and harassing them out of areas of the capital. Reprisals naturally followed. The Sing-Song coalition was generally successful in stamping out the insurrection. They even managed to kill Prince Harry in fierce fighting in the home counties. But the greatest moment of triumph for the Sing-Song coalition was the capture of Tony Blair himself. Mr. Song announced the capture of the fugitive in a pithy expression that had a sort of film-like ring to it, but sounded vulgar in translation. Something like, "Ladies and gentlemen, we got him." He had been hiding for months in a dark underground basement in a leafy residential area of West London. He looked a wreck when they pulled him out of his hole with his long and scraggly beard. He was examined by a military doctor of the Chinese before the cameras. The footage was paraded on screens all over the world. He was allowed to stammer to his captors, "Come on now, let's not be silly about this," umpteen times in a kangaroo court, before being sentenced to hang by the neck in the old-fashioned British way. After this, the Sing-Song coalition esteemed that their job was done and left the fragile country in the incapable hands of the provisional government. Unfortunately for the provisional government, while the insurrectionists were gathered in prisons of mass detention and treated somewhat brutally as it transpired, Blairites, English nationalists, and radical moral reformers vowed to fight in common cause against the government. When things had seemed to quieten down, the provisional government decided to amnesty political prisoners in the hope of gaining social peace. It was from the ranks of those amnestied prisoners that a new and determined resistance was formed. Those fighters have been tearing the country apart to this very day, to the point where plans for the intervention of another international coalition are on the diplomatic table. This time, unfortunately for fans of euphony, without Mr. Singh, who lost his premiership in an election. It would seem that in India the original enthusiasm for saving a foreign nation through arms turned sour when the cheery messianic idea became the grim reality of war on the ground.